On December 7, 1941, amid the wailing sirens over Pearl Harbor, an often overlooked detail appeared in the diary of Japanese pilot Saburo Sakai. He wrote that he had seen American planes burning, smoking like beasts driven into a corner, while the Zero he flew remained intact, maneuvering like a samurai sword slicing through the sky. For Sakai and his comrades, this was not merely a victory, it was confirmation of a deeply rooted belief. They were flying the most perfect aerial weapon in the world. In fact, the arrival of the Mitsubishi A6M Zero before the war had already shocked even Japan's own military establishment. During its first test flights in 1940, many engineers could hardly believe the figures. A lightweight fighter capable of reaching speeds over 500 km/h, climbing to 6,000 meters in under 6 minutes, and covering nearly 3,000 kilometers without refueling. At the time, no American or European aircraft could match such a combination of speed, agility, and range. What set the Zero apart was the daring design philosophy of Chief Engineer Horikoshi Jiro. He and his team reduced weight to the absolute minimum, stripping away almost all armor and fire suppression systems, features Americans considered essential for keeping pilots alive. Instead, they wagered everything on absolute maneuverability. Every component was pared down, from thin aluminum frames to unprotected fuel tanks. The result was a machine that, as Sakai once described, could bend to the will of the pilot. For the first 2 years of World War II, that gamble gave Japan an unprecedented advantage. Over Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Malaya, and Singapore, the Zero met virtually no equal. American pilots flying the heavier F-4F Wildcat were often forced onto the defensive. Allied reports frequently described entire squadrons being shredded by just a handful of Zeros, which closed in and dispatched them with clinical precision. Many U.S. servicemen dubbed the aircraft the White Devil, a reference both to its pale paint and to the terror of facing it in combat. A stark example came during the Philippines campaign in the first week of December 1941. The Zero appeared alongside Japanese bombers and swiftly dominated Manila's skies. American pilots often found their airfields ablaze before they could take off. Those who did manage to get airborne were soon trapped by Zero's tight turns. The mismatch was obvious. P-40 Warhawks tried to engage, but with turn radii nearly twice as wide, they were easy prey. Within a week, U.S. and Filipino forces lost hundreds of aircraft, while Zeros shot down could be counted on one hand. Japanese faith in the Zero rested not only on statistics, but also on a profound sense of unity between pilot and machine. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, later Japan's highest-scoring ace, once wrote to his younger brother, "The Zero is our sword. When I become one with it, I feel as though I am riding a living spirit through the sky." These words were not mere propaganda. For many Japanese pilots, the Zero truly embodied a seamless fusion of man and technology, something they believed the West could never understand. This conviction was reinforced in early 1942 over the Indian Ocean, when Zeros clashed with Britain's Hurricanes and Fulmars during the raid on the Royal Navy. The outcome was astonishing. Dozens of British aircraft were destroyed for negligible Zero losses. Mitsuo Fuchida, the officer who led the Pearl Harbor attack, noted in his report that the kill-loss ratio was enough to surprise even the most optimistic among us. At forward bases, it was not uncommon for Japanese pilots to hurl themselves into formations many times their size. Saburo Sakai himself once attacked a group of American bombers alone, intent on proving the superiority of both the Zero and Japanese skill. Many believed that the spirit of Bushido, fused with this ultimate weapon, would carry Japan to final victory. Yet behind those dazzling triumphs lay warnings few dared to acknowledge. At Midway in June 1942, when 4 of Japan's main carriers were sunk, more than 100 of its most seasoned pilots never returned. These were elite aviators who had fought from China to Pearl Harbor, carrying thousands of flight hours, irreplaceable in the short term. With a training program that eliminated 95% of cadets, the Japanese Navy could not replace them quickly enough. Even so, throughout 1942, Japan's military leaders remained confident that the Zero had lost none of its supremacy. To them, losses were temporary, and pilot skill and spirit would suffice to maintain dominance. They did not yet realize that across the Pacific, America was quietly preparing a new generation of fighters, heavier, more powerful, and mass-produced in staggering numbers. When Warrant Officer Nishizawa praised the Zero's perfection in February 1943, he could not imagine that only days later, over the Solomon Islands, a strange gull-winged American fighter would appear, bringing unprecedented speed, firepower, and armor. For the first time, Japanese pilots accustomed to feeling invincible would be forced to ask, was the Zero still the ultimate weapon? What happened next, when the Zero first encountered the Corsair, and why that meeting became a turning point in the entire air war over the Pacific, is a story of its own. In February 1943, as the roar of Zeros still echoed across the skies of the Solomon Islands, a new silhouette appeared on the narrow runway at Guadalcanal. It was the F-4U Corsair, with wings bent downward like a giant seagull rising from the sea. American pilots, seeing it for the first time, could hardly hide their astonishment. A long nose housing the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP 18-cylinder engine, capable of generating over 2,000 horsepower, making the entire fuselage tremble like a steel beast poised to leap into the sky. If the Zero was likened to a katana, light, sharp, and agile, then the Corsair was the West's war hammer, heavy, powerful, and unstoppable once it struck. With a top speed of up to 690 km/h at medium altitude, the Corsair far exceeded the Zero's capabilities. It could dive at over 800 km/h without the airframe failing, while the Zero began shaking violently at much lower speeds. In terms of firepower, 6 12.7mm Browning M2 machine guns along the wings created a dense hail of bullets. One short burst could turn any Zero into a ball of fire. But the Corsair was not only powerful, it was also rugged. The fuselage was armored, fuel tanks were self-sealing, and the cockpit offered far better protection than the almost bare Zero. In early combat, American pilots discovered an astonishing fact. A Corsair could take several 20mm hits from Zeros and keep flying, whereas a single lucky shot could ignite a Zero. This difference led to iconic encounters in the skies over the Solomons. Pappy Boyington, the commander of the Black Sheep Squadron, VMF 214, recalled that when he first flew the Corsair in combat, he felt as if he were riding a giant beast, both wild and loyal, waiting only for my command to strike the enemy. In Boyington's hands, the Corsair became a true predator. Within a few months, he and his squadron claimed over 90 victories, turning the Black Sheep into legend. Boyington was not alone. At Rabaul, American pilots often faced hundreds of Zeros from Japanese naval bases. When the Corsair appeared, the situation changed dramatically. In February 1944, during a series of dogfights over Rabaul, the Corsair demonstrated overwhelming superiority. According to U.S. Navy records, over just 2 days, they shot down more than 70 Japanese aircraft while losing fewer than 10 Corsairs. Even American officers were surprised. Until then, they had never imagined being able to crush the Zero so decisively. Corsair's dominance was not just about speed or firepower. It was about controlling the engagement. If the Zero excelled in tight turns, the Corsair ruled with the boom and zoom tactic. Dive from above, unleash a hail of bullets, then escape at superior speed. In such attacks, the Zero had little chance to counter, as following the Corsair required dives faster than its fragile airframe could withstand. One of the most famous Corsair pilots was Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, who later scored 28 victories and received the Medal of Honor. In his memoirs, he described Zeros being torn apart like thin paper by a single short burst. For Boyington, the Corsair was more than a plane. It was a steel seagull signaling a new dawn over the Pacific skies. Combat statistics quickly reinforced this legendary image. By the end of 1944, the Corsair had an 11.1 kill ratio against Japanese aircraft, meaning for every Corsair lost in combat, 11 enemy planes were destroyed. This ratio surpassed even the P-51 Mustang in Europe and became one of the most dominant records in military aviation history. Many U.S. pilots admitted that after flying the Corsair, they no longer feared the Zero. For comparison, the Zero in 1941-1942 had been celebrated for its near-perfect kill ratios. But by 1943-1944, with the arrival of the Corsair and Hellcat, the balance of power had shifted. The Zero now resembled a swordsman who had felled every opponent with a sharp blade, suddenly facing heavily armored warriors wielding steel warhammers. Technical finesse and courage alone were no longer enough against an enemy backed by advanced technology and industrial production. Images of the Corsair on carrier decks or in black and white photographs from Guadalcanal evoke a giant seabird in flight. Its distinctive inverted gull wings, initially considered odd, became a symbol of America's new aerial power. To accommodate the massive engine and a propeller over 4 meters long, engineers designed the wings to bend downward, as if the plane were tucking its wings before diving into the sea. This shape, however, created a striking, aggressive silhouette unlike any other fighter of the era. The Corsair reached its peak during the Marshall Islands campaign, and later in the Marianas in 1944. As the U.S. launched operations to reclaim territory from Japan, the Corsair became an aerial steel shield. Over Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, hundreds of Corsairs escorted bombers, intercepted Zeros, and protected the fleet. In the Battle of the Philippine Sea, often called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Corsairs contributed to the destruction of over 300 Japanese aircraft in just 2 days. The Zero went from terror of the skies to prey, while the Corsair and Hellcat became relentless hunters. Corsair superiority was confirmed not only by numbers but also by morale. Japanese pilots, once believing the Zero invincible, now faced harsh reality. They could hit a Corsair, but it continued to fly, guns blazing, while their comrades fell into the sea. Conversely, American pilots grew more confident with each sortie, treating the Corsair as a good luck charm that ensured survival. The Corsair also became a nightmare for Japanese ground forces. With its ability to carry bombs and rockets, it served as both fighter and formidable ground attack aircraft. The image of Corsairs diving on Japanese fortifications, blasting bunkers with rockets, and swooping back up from the sea left an indelible mark on both American and surviving Japanese soldiers. By 1945, the Corsair had fully overcome early doubts about carrier takeoffs and landings, becoming the main fighter of the U.S. Marine Corps and Navy. From Guadalcanal to Okinawa, from the Black Sheep to other famous squadrons, the Corsair proved itself not merely as a weapon, but as a symbol of America's reclamation of the Pacific skies. To Americans, the Corsair was the death seagull, wings spread over the vast ocean hunting its enemies. To Japanese pilots, it marked the end of the Zero era. Once the kings of the sky, they now had to evade, hide, and sacrifice more just to cling to a shred of hope. But would technological superiority alone allow the U.S. to end the war quickly, or would the Japanese find a way to fight back? The answer lay in the fierce dogfights yet to come, when the Zero and Corsair clashed in the final stages of the war. In June 1944, over the Philippine Sea, the rising sun revealed an unprecedented scene. The sky swarmed with American aircraft, squadron after squadron moving like schools of steel sharks toward the Japanese fleet. Among them, the F-4U Corsairs stood out, their unusual inverted gull wings gliding like giant seagulls. Opposing them, Mitsubishi A6M Zeros still took off from Japanese carriers. But the feeling had changed. Japanese pilots knew they were about to face the most fearsome enemy ever to appear over the Pacific. For the Zero, appearance had once symbolized elegance. Its slender aluminum frame and long, narrow wings made it look like a sleek bird ready to pivot at the pilot's command. But next to the Corsair, the difference was immediately apparent. The Corsair was massive, with inverted gull wings resembling enormous claws, a long nose housing a 2,000 horsepower engine roaring so loudly the ground trembled. If the Zero was a samurai wielding a katana, the Corsair was a knight in iron armor swinging a heavy warhammer. In the first battles over Rabaul and Truk, this truth was brutally revealed. Japanese pilot Saburo Sakai, who had survived hundreds of dogfights, described the stunning sight of Corsairs diving from above at terrifying speeds, leaving trails of bullets in their wake. He recalled, "We tried to circle to trap the enemy, but the Corsair did not play by those rules. They dove, unleashed fire, and vanished into the sky faster than the eye could follow." This exposed the Zero's fatal weakness. It forced opponents into dogfights, but the Corsair did not. It was not just speed. Firepower added to the overwhelming advantage. 6 synchronized 12.7mm Browning machine guns created a dense wall of bullets. Many American pilots reported that a single short burst could turn a Zero into a ball of fire. Japanese pilots, used to seeing opponents go down after a few 20mm hits, now faced adversaries seemingly unkillable. The Corsair, with its armored cockpit and self-sealing fuel tanks, could sustain serious damage and still return its pilots safely to base. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, called the Great Marianas Turkey, shoot by the Americans, turned astonishment into horror. When hundreds of Zeros scrambled to defend the Japanese fleet, they were immediately intercepted by Corsair and Hellcat squadrons. The results were staggering. Over 2 days, more than 300 Japanese aircraft were shot down, while U.S. losses were almost negligible. One American officer recorded in his journal, "This was no longer a battle. It was a massacre in the air." The sight of Zeros burning and plummeting into the sea in trails of black smoke contrasted sharply with the imposing silhouette of the Corsair. The Japanese, who had once proudly called the Zero the sword of the sky, now watched it shatter before flying iron hammers. Young Japanese pilots, many with only a few dozen hours of training, were thrown into battle with the fragile hope that courage could compensate for technology. But reality was harsh. Before completing their first turn, the Corsair had already struck from behind. In memoirs, an anonymous Japanese pilot wrote, "We saw those strange bent wings and felt a chill run down our spines. It was unlike anything we had ever faced. When the Corsair dove, the whole sky seemed to collapse. We fired back, but our bullets were useless, while theirs kept spitting fire." This was not merely personal emotion. It reflected a broader psychological shift. From absolute confidence, Japanese pilots now began to fear the sound of an R-2800 engine roaring from a distance. The Corsair also stunned the Zero with its versatility. While the Zero could only function as a fighter, the Corsair could carry bombs and rockets, transforming into a formidable ground attack platform. In the Marshalls, Marianas, and Philippines, Corsairs hunted Zeros while simultaneously clearing bases, destroying warships, and crushing Japanese fortifications. The Zero, born to rule the skies, now faced a desperate mission. To take off and attempt to repel attacks, it was ill-equipped. To stop, one of the most dramatic air battles, occurred over Okinawa in early 1945, as Japan launched waves of kamikaze attacks against the U.S. fleet. Corsairs were deployed extensively to intercept them. Zeros, no longer predators, became suicidal arrows, diving at American ships with deadly resolve. Yet the Corsairs, with superior speed and firepower, intercepted most of them. In American memories, the skies over Okinawa were filled with burning Zeros, while Corsairs spread their wings like knights guarding the fleet. With each encounter, the technological gap became clearer. The Zero, conceived in 1940 with the philosophy of light, fast, agile, was now obsolete against an enemy born later but superior in every aspect. The Corsair swept away the old legend like a steel storm, leaving a bitter legacy for an entire generation of Japanese pilots. From the first engagements, shock turned to despair. Saburo Sakai, one of the rare survivors of many dogfights, admitted, "We no longer controlled the skies. Every takeoff felt like a gamble with death." The Zero, Japan's pride, had become a deadly trap for its own pilots. These words closed an era. The Zero, once an invincible legend, had become a symbol of obsolescence. The Corsair, with its majestic bent wings and thunderous roar, had replaced it as the lord of the Pacific skies. But would technological superiority be enough for the U.S. to end the war, or would the Japanese unleash their final desperate tactics to cling to lost glory? On April 6, 1945, the skies over Okinawa were ablaze. From the few remaining airfields on the Kyushu Islands, hundreds of aging Zeros roared into the air, not to fight as they once had. This time, they carried bombs slung beneath their bellies, fuel tanks dangerously full, and pilots with only one course, a direct dive into American warships. This was Kikusui, Japan's largest kamikaze operation in history, and also the death knell for the Zero's legend. The Battle of Okinawa was the Zero's most critical engagement in its final phase. Lacking the technology to confront Corsairs or Hellcats, the Zero was forced to become a suicide weapon. The planes that once dominated the skies were now loaded with explosives, stripped of excess armor, and filled with fuel to ignite upon impact. Pilots, many barely out of flight school and trained in just a few dozen hours, took off clutching a lucky charm in their uniforms and a vow, "Live like a cherry blossom, brilliant." Brief and then gone. That morning, 23-year-old pilot Yukio Seki wrote in his diary, "Mother, I am sorry. I have nothing to leave behind but this death. But I die so that my country may live. If the cherry blossom blooms brilliantly once, then I will bloom over the skies of Okinawa." Years later, his words became emblematic of an entire generation's tragedy. Yet this sacrifice did not change the balance of power. In the skies, Corsairs and Hellcats formed protective screens. American radar detected Japanese planes from afar, and anti-aircraft fire from ships rained down like steel storms. In the first Kikusui wave, Japan sent over 350 aircraft, including hundreds of Zeros. The outcome was devastatingly lopsided. More than 250 planes were shot down before reaching their targets. Only a few dozen pilots succeeded, causing some damage to U.S. ships, but not enough to alter the situation. An American eyewitness, a sailor aboard the destroyer USS Laffey, recalled, "We saw Zeros plunging like living torches. One exploded just tens of meters from the ship, debris raining down on the deck. It was a strange feeling, fear and pity at the same time. They were no longer fighting. They were turning themselves into flying bombs." The climax of the tragedy came in mid-April. Japan launched 10 successive Kikusui waves, totaling more than 1,500 aircraft, mostly Zeros. Yet the results were disproportionate. Nearly 2,300 planes were shot down, while the U.S. lost only 36 ships and about 368 were damaged. In absolute terms, U.S. losses were not negligible. But compared to Japan's price, a whole generation of young pilots sacrificed, this was an unrecoverable failure. The Zero, once the ultimate weapon, had become a tool of suicide. A veneer of tragic romanticism masked a harsh reality. Japan had been technologically outpaced. Corsairs and Hellcats still ruled the skies. B-29s continued bombing Tokyo, and Zeros, unable to climb fast enough to intercept, were reduced to final missions. American pilots were haunted as well. Many wrote in their journals that they could not forget the brief moment when a Zero dove toward them and the pilot was visible in the cockpit. Calm, resolute, a warrior accepting his fate. One former Corsair pilot recalled, "They were not afraid to die. That sent shivers down our spines." But it also made us realize they had already lost, because when a nation can only compensate for technology with human lives, its future is over. By May 1945, as Okinawa neared collapse, the number of operational Zeros was down to a few. Most remaining planes were old, paint peeling, engines struggling. Many pilots had to fly their Zeros as if piloting flying coffins. Post-war documents reveal that many Japanese knew they could not win, yet still took off, because refusal meant treason. The pinnacle of despair came in August 1945, when Hiroshima and Nagasaki were flattened by atomic bombs. By then, the Zero was no longer a weapon, only a symbol of a bygone era. Surviving aircraft lay abandoned on bombed-out runways, rusting in the rain, or were seized by American forces for study. From the glory of Pearl Harbor to the suicidal dives over Okinawa, the Zero completed the full arc of a legend, from absolute dominance to irrecoverable defeat. When Saburo Sakai, a rare surviving pilot, returned after the war, he stood for hours before a rusted Zero in a museum. He said, "These were once our wings, the pride of our nation. But looking now, I see only sorrow. We believed courage could replace technology. That mistake cost an entire generation of young men. The Zero, once the symbol of Japan's early WWII glory, ended its fate plunging into the ocean in desperate dives. Meanwhile, the Corsair and other American fighters witnessed the entire process, from gazing up at the legend to watching it fall like a fading cherry blossom. But is the Zero's legacy only a tragedy? Or does it still offer valuable lessons for the world of aviation after the war? When World War II ended, the remaining Zeros lay scattered across Asia, from overgrown airstrips in the Philippines and bombed-out runways in Okinawa to empty hangars in Japan. Some were burned, their metal frames twisted like the carcasses of fallen birds. Some were dismantled and left in the sun and rain for American soldiers to photograph as souvenirs. And a few luckier ones were shipped to the US, Australia, and Britain for study. Wings that once inspired terror now became trophies, lying quietly in storage, awaiting a new role as witnesses of history. In the years after 1945, debates about the Zero were heated. Some regarded it as Japan's technological masterpiece, a fighter ahead of its time, astonishing the world. Others saw it as a symbol of flawed wartime thinking, placing faith in suicidal courage rather than long-term technological and strategic innovation. In reality, both perspectives were correct. The Zero represented the pinnacle of speed and maneuverability thinking, but it also demonstrated the danger when a nation becomes intoxicated with early victories and ignores its technological limits. The greatest lesson of the Zero is clear. No legend is immortal when technology and strategy change. In 1940, the Zero was a fierce tiger. By 1945, it had become a frail bird. Not because Japanese pilots had declined, but because the Americans had learned, adapted, and surpassed them with superior technology. The emergence of the F6F Hellcat, F4U Corsair, along with radar systems, pilot training programs, and massive industrial supply chains, gradually pushed the Zero out of the skies. In that ruthless race, a single misstep sealed its fate. Yet from the Zero, the aviation world gained invaluable lessons. Post-war American designers admitted that only by studying captured Zeros did they fully understand the value of weight optimization, agility, and long-range capabilities. The Zero influenced the next generation of jet fighters, not in specific technology, but in philosophy. Every aircraft must find its unique strength rather than trying to do everything. Without the Zero, Corsairs and Hellcats might not have evolved so quickly to achieve overwhelming dominance. For Japan, the Zero's legacy is even more complex. It was a source of national pride in the early days of the war, but also a heavy shadow after defeat. Surviving pilots like Saburo Sakai carried lifelong trauma. They had once dominated the skies, only to watch young comrades plunge into the sea in kamikaze missions. For them, the Zero was both wings of freedom and a flying coffin. That lesson was etched into the Japanese consciousness. Courage alone cannot replace technological advancement and practical strategy. By the 1960s and 1970s, as Japan's economy revived, the Zero began to be seen differently. Some models were restored for exhibition, no longer as a symbol of war, but as a reminder. Aviation museums in Tokyo, Pearl Harbor, and Washington preserved Zeros either in original or restored condition. Visitors stood silently before the silver wings, sometimes still marked with bullet holes, understanding that history is not only about victories or defeats, it is also about the tragedy of those caught in the whirlwind of their times. The Corsair, the Zero's direct adversary, left its own legacy. If the Zero symbolized fleeting glory, the Corsair represented enduring technological might. The Americans demonstrated that victory does not come from a single brilliant moment, but from an entire system, industry, training, and coordinated strategy. This contrast made the story of Zero and Corsair a classic lesson in military history. From a broader perspective, The fate of the Zero illustrates a harsh law of modern warfare. No weapon, however advanced, has an unlimited shelf life on the battlefield. The death of the Zero signaled the end of the propeller era and the dawn of the jet age. Immediately after the war, nations raced to develop jet fighters such as Germany's Me-262, America's F-86 Sabre, and the Soviet MiG-15. The Zero, proud and tragic, remained a marker, bridging two worlds. Yet the deepest value of the Zero lies in its human dimension. Young Japanese pilots, many barely in their 20s, flew it through both triumph and despair. Yukio Seki's diary, Sakai's accounts, and the fleeting moments of kamikaze dives all became part of humanity's shared memory of sacrifice, courage, and misperception. This is the human aspect of history, reminding us that beyond statistics, we can feel the breath and heartbeat of those who lived and died with the Zero. Today, when a rare Zero still flies in air shows, audiences stand in silence. The Nakajima Sakai engine roars, unlike any modern jet, reminding us that once the skies of the Pacific feared these wings. Yet it also reminds us that every glory comes with a price. The Zero was more than an aircraft. It is a metaphor for a cherry blossom, blooming brilliantly, then falling in the wind. Its beauty lay in its brevity. Its legend was forged in the tragedy of its life cycle. From those wings, humanity learned a truth. Courage must be paired with intelligence, and victory belongs only to those who adapt to the times. When leaving a museum and taking one last look at a dusty Zero, one carries the image of its broken silver wings. It whispers through time, "Never let pride cloud reason." Even the bravest bird, if flying against the winds of its era, will break its wings and fall into the sea.